The sky over Meridian Hollow was the color of wheat that morning, and Elena Vasquez thought, not for the first time, that it was the most beautiful thing humanity had ever been given for free. She stood at the edge of the eastern dome, watching sprinkler drones weave low over rows of amber gold stalks that shouldn't have been able to grow on a world this dry. 5 years ago, this stretch of Kessia 9 had been cracked red dirt. Now it fed 40,000 people across 3 systems, human and otherwise, and Elena had signed every one of those export manifests herself. "You're doing the proud mom face again," said her daughter, dropping into the seat beside her on the observation platform. "I'm allowed to have a proud mom face. I grew the wheat that's currently feeding a Vren nursery colony." Elena bumped Mika's shoulder with her own. "Where's Tess?" "Late, as usual." Mika grinned, the particular grin of a 16-year-old who had appointed herself best friend to the only Vren exchange student on Kessia 9 and would defend that title against all comers. "She said her mother wanted to talk to you today, something important." Elena's smile didn't fade, but something behind her eyes sharpened, just slightly. The look of a woman who had learned in 5 years of frontier diplomacy that important rarely meant good news. Tess found them an hour later, chitinous and quick and breathless, in the way only a Vren adolescent trying to run in low gravity could be. Her translator collar crackled. "My mother says come now, please. It concerns the Syndromoth." Elena's stomach dropped an inch. The Syndromoth were a hardline faction within the Vren collective, the kind that showed up in intelligence briefings more than they showed up in person. Isolationists who believed the collective's alliance with the soft-skinned newcomers was a slow-motion surrender of Vren sovereignty. Tess's family were dissidents who'd fled Syndromoth territory 2 years ago and asked Meridian Hollow for quiet asylum. Elena had granted it without hesitation and without telling Fleet Command more than she had to. She was still walking toward the administrative dome, Mika and Tess half jogging to keep pace, when the alert klaxon began to howl. 3 ships had dropped out of slipspace at the edge of the system. Not warships flying attack profiles, but a diplomatic cruiser with proper transponder codes and a full honor escort. Elena exhaled. Diplomatic. That was survivable. She'd navigated worse. She was wrong, and she knew it the moment Speaker Dvalka stepped off the shuttle ramp. He was tall even for a Vren. His carapace scarred pale along one flank in the way of someone who had fought and meant to keep fighting. He did not offer the customary claw-touch greeting. He simply said through his translator, "You harbor Vren citizens who are enemies of the collective. Surrender them or accept the consequences of treaty violation." "There is no treaty that requires me to hand asylum seekers to a faction that wants them dead, Speaker," Elena said, keeping her voice level, keeping her hands visible and empty. "If the collective has a formal extradition request, I welcome it through proper channels." Proper channels. Dvalka's mandibles clicked in something that might have been contempt. "You gave them channels. You gave them your crops, your technology, your trust. And they used it to hide traitors who would burn the collective from the inside." He turned his head slightly, and Elena would remember later that in that moment he looked less like a fanatic and more like a man reciting lines he'd been given, testing their weight in his own mouth. "This is your last channel, Director." "Then I'm afraid we're done talking," Elena said quietly. She was already turning to signal the evacuation alert when the sky ignited. The orbital strike didn't come as a single blinding flash the way the old films always showed it. It came as a stutter of impacts, precise and surgical, aimed at the shield generator ring around the colony's northern quarter. Elena felt the ground buck under her before she heard the sound. And then the sound arrived all at once, a physical wall of noise that knocked her flat. She was up again in seconds, screaming for Mika, and found her. Found both girls, crouched behind an irrigation trench, Tess's collar sparking, Mika's ears bleeding from the concussion. Around them, the eastern dome was folding in on itself in slow, terrible motion, wheat and glass and drone parts raining down together. Ground troops came through the breach within minutes. Not soldiers looking for surrender, troops with incendiary rifles moving room to room, dome to dome, with the methodical thoroughness of an act that had been planned, briefed, and rehearsed. This was not retaliation. This was erasure. Elena made a choice in the half-second she had to make it. She pushed Mika and Tess toward the underground shelter access, shouting directions to a knot of terrified colonists behind her, and turned back toward the administrative dome, toward the transmitter that could still, maybe, reach the Harmattan in orbit. 200 kilometers up, Commander Adaize Okonkwo was standing in the crippled engine bay of the ICS Harmattan, elbow deep in a coupling that her chief engineer swore would hold for one more jump, when the distress signal hit her earpiece and didn't stop. "Report," she snapped, already moving. "Orbital bombardment, Commander. Ground forces confirmed it's—" The comms officer's voice cracked. "It's Meridian Hollow. It's the whole colony." Adaize reached the bridge in under 90 seconds. The tactical display told her everything her body already knew. 3 Syndrameth vessels in low orbit, weapons hot, and her own ship's slip drive in pieces on a maintenance rack 4 decks down. She could not jump. She could barely maneuver. She had 11 functioning point defense turrets and no shields worth the name, against a strike group that had just leveled a civilian colony without so much as a declaration. "Get me anything," she said. "Drones, sensor buoys, I don't care. I need eyes down there." The drone feed that came back showed her fire. Fields of it, orange against the wheat gold, smoke pillaring into a sky that had been, an hour ago, the color of something worth being proud of. Adaize watched Elena Vasquez's last transmission arrive in fragments, the audio shredding under jamming interference. "Can't reach the— Mika's safe, she's with— Tell them we didn't—" The signal died mid-word. Adaize stood very still for 3 seconds, hands flat on the tactical console, and made herself breathe. Then she looked up at her bridge crew, young, frightened, watching her the way people watch someone they've decided will tell them what to do next. "Toma," she said to her engineer, who had followed her up from the engine bay, greased to the elbows. "How long until that drive holds under thrust?" "Optimistically, 6 hours. Realistically, I don't know if it holds at all." "Then we do this the hard way." Adaize turned back to the screen, to the smoke, to the 3 Syndramoth ships already breaking orbit, running. "Charge every point defense cell we have and get me a firing solution on their engine trails. We are not letting them walk away from this." Below, in the wreckage of the Eastern Dome, Mika Vasquez dragged Tess out from beneath a collapsed support beam, her mother's name a raw sound in her throat, and found only silence where the shelter door should have been. Above, on the Harmattan's long-range scope, a junior sensor tech frowned at a return that didn't match any known Syndramoth hull signature. A 4th ship, running dark, transponder scrubbed clean, sitting at the very edge of detection range. It wasn't fleeing. It was watching. And as Adaize opened her mouth to ask what in God's name it was, the contact blinked out of existence, gone as if it had never been there at all, leaving her with a burning colony, a crippled ship, 3 fleeing warships, and the sick, certain knowledge that whatever had just happened to Meridian Hollow was not the whole story. It was only the first page. The rescue teams found Elena Vasquez's body 11 hours after the attack, still gripping the transmitter she'd died trying to reach. Mika did not cry when they told her. She had already used up every tear she had in the shelter, holding Tess's trembling claws in the dark, listening to the muffled screaming above them fade into a silence that was somehow worse. What Mika did instead, in the days that followed, was organize. She found Adaize Okonkwo on the second morning, standing in the wreckage of the administrative dome with a data slate in one hand, cataloging losses like a woman building a case file instead of grieving a colony. Mika recognized the posture. Her mother had worn it too on bad days. "You're the commander," Mika said. It wasn't a question. "I am." Adaize studied her, the ash on her clothes, the steadiness in her eyes that had no business being there. "You're Director Vasquez's daughter. I have her authorization codes for the colony archive. Nobody's asked for them yet." Mika held up a battered slate. "There's flight recorder data from 3 drones that survived the strike. Black box telemetry from the shield generators before they went down. I think it shows the attack was planned before Speaker Dvalka ever landed. I think you're going to want to see it before Fleet Command turns this into a diplomatic apology tour. Adiz looked at her for a long moment, and something in her chest, grief, maybe, or recognition, loosened just slightly. How old are you? Old enough that my mother trusted me to run comms during colony drills. I know the systems. Mika's chin lifted. I'm not asking permission, Commander. I'm telling you what I found. Daisy almost smiled. Almost. Bring it to the Harmattan. And bring your Vren friend if she's willing. I have a feeling we're going to need her family's testimony too, whatever's left of it. The data told a story that made Daisy's jaw tighten with every past second of playback. The Syndromoth strike group had been in system, powered up and weapons primed, 4 full hours before Dvalka's shuttle ever touched ground. This hadn't been a negotiation that went wrong. The negotiation had been theater, a formality performed for a decision already made. Fleet Command, when Daisy transmitted the findings up the chain, responded with the particular caution of people very far away from the smoke. Confirm intelligence through official channels before pursuit. Interspecies incident of this magnitude requires diplomatic review. Do not engage. Adiz read the order twice, then set the slate down on the console with more care than the moment deserved. Because if she'd let herself do anything else, she'd have thrown it across the bridge. Toma, she said. Status on the drive. Her chief engineer, Toma Reyes, had not slept in 30 hours and looked it, but his hands were steady as he ran a diagnostic. It'll hold for short jumps if I baby it. I've been cannibalizing parts off the Syndromoth debris field. Their alloy composition is close enough to ours that I can fake a compatible coupling. It's ugly. It'll probably void every warranty in fleet inventory, but it'll fly. Do it. Adiz looked around her bridge. 22 crew, most of them younger than she liked to admit. All of them watching her with the same question in their eyes that Mika had asked with her posture instead of her mouth. What are we going to do about this? Fleet Command wants us to wait for a diplomatic review, Adiz said. Colonial Protection Protocol gives ship commanders discretionary authority to pursue hostile forces that have attacked a settlement under fleet jurisdiction, provided pursuit does not constitute a declaration of war. I'm invoking that protocol. Anyone who has a problem with that can log a formal objection. I'll make sure it's read into the record, after. Nobody objected. They found the Syndromoth strike group 40 hours later, holed up in a debris-choked binary system refueling before what was clearly meant to be a long run home. Daisy studied the tactical picture with Toma at her shoulder and felt something that was almost, dangerously, close to satisfaction. 3 ships, full shields, functioning weapons. We've got a limping frigate with a drive held together by good intentions and scrap metal, Toma said. I want to point out for the record that this is a terrible plan. It's not a terrible plan, it's an honest plan. We can't out-armor them and we can't outgun them. Adiz pulled up a system map, the asteroid field ringing the binary stars like a broken necklace. But we can outthink them. Fighters flying honor-bound engagement doctrine expect a straight fight. We give them a debris field instead. The battle that followed would, months later, be studied in 3 different fleet academies, though never quite the same way twice. Diaz took the Harmattan into the asteroid field at a speed that made her navigator physically flinch, using the tumbling rock as cover from the Syndromoth's superior sensors and heavier batteries. Toma had spent the transit hours building, with parts scavenged from irrigation drones, colony power cells, and the enemy's own wreckage, a set of improvised electromagnetic pulse charges, crude and short-ranged and utterly unlike anything in a standard fleet arsenal. It's farm equipment, he admitted over the comm, voice tight with adrenaline as the Harmattan threaded between 2 colliding rocks. I built weapons out of irrigation drones, Commander. Then let's see what irrigation drones can do. They caught the lead Syndromoth vessel in a debris shadow at close range, too close for its shields to compensate for the sudden electromagnetic bloom Toma's charges unleashed against its hull. Systems flickered. Weapons batteries went dark. It was not a killing blow. It didn't need to be. It bought the Harmattan 90 seconds of a crippled enemy drifting helpless among the rocks, And a daze took every one of those seconds, boarding party already suited and moving before the enemy's counterfire even found its range again. What they found aboard that ship changed everything. It wasn't in the command deck, where a daze expected to find orders confirming fleet's suspicion of a targeted, premeditated strike. It was in the ship's secondary data core, half melted by the EMP surge but not destroyed. Fragments of encrypted communications between Speaker Dvalka's staff and an off-network source that didn't match any known Syndramoth or Vren collective signature at all. Toma pulled what he could onto a portable drive while Adaisi covered the corridor, her weapon steady despite the tremor she could feel building in her own hands, the adrenaline crash already creeping in at the edges. "Commander," Toma said, voice gone strange. "You need to see this." On the salvaged screen, buried in a folder labeled in a cipher Toma's translation software was still chewing through, was a single recovered phrase, repeated across a dozen message headers like a project name, a code word, a signature. Ashgrain. Beneath it, half-corrupted but unmistakable, was a partial star chart. Coordinates plotted not toward Syndramoth space, not toward any Vren collective world at all, but outward, past the frontier, toward a small yellow star that Adaise recognized immediately, because she had grown up beneath its light. Sol. Behind her, the ship's hull groaned as the crippled Syndramoth vessel's backup power flickered back online, and somewhere above them, klaxons that were not her own began to wail. "Commander?" Her helmet comm crackled, Toma's voice sharp now. "Their shields are recharging. We need to go. Now." Adaise grabbed the drive out of his hands, and one last thought followed her all the way back to the airlock, cold and unshakable. Whatever Ashgrain was, whoever had fed Speaker Dvalka the lie that burned Meridian hollow to ash, they had been planning to look toward Earth long before the first shot was ever fired. Fleet Intelligence's response to the word Ashgrain was silence, and then 3 days later a summons. Adaise stood in a briefing room aboard the relay station Concordance Point and watched 4 admirals and one very tired-looking undersecretary of Alien Affairs pass her recovered data drive between them like it might bite. Nobody wanted to say the word conspiracy out loud. Nobody wanted to say the word war either, which amounted to the same caution wearing a different uniform. "You engaged a foreign power without authorization," said Admiral Wren, not for the first time. "I invoked Colonial Protection Protocol, which is on record, and I recovered intelligence pointing to a coordinated attack on Earth's own system," Adaise said, keeping her voice level, though her patience was fraying thin as old wire. "I would very much like someone in this room to focus on that second part." It was Ambassador Yeth Corvain who finally did. The Cylindri diplomat had been seated quietly at the end of the table through the whole exchange, pale-scaled and unreadable in the way of a species that had spent 400 years perfecting patience as a diplomatic weapon. When he finally spoke, the room went still because Yeth Corvain did not speak without reason. "I know that word," he said. "Ashgrain. I have heard it whispered in 3 different sectors over the past 2 years, always in the same context. Factional violence that made no sense on its face. A trade war on Doriel's reach that started over a mineral contract nobody actually needed. A civil schism among the Kethri that fractured a 500-year alliance in 6 months. Each time afterward, quiet money and quieter weapons turn up from a source no one can trace." He folded his hands. "I believe Ashgrain is not a place, Commander Okonkwo. I believe it is an organization. One that profits from convincing people like Speaker Dvalka that their neighbors are their enemies." "Convincing him how?" Adaise asked. Yeth's expression, for the first time in the meeting, cracked into something like old grief. "I do not know yet, but I intend to find out because I have spent my career building the alliance they are trying to burn down, and I will not watch it happen from a briefing room." It was the first time in 5 years of frontier work that Adaise had heard an alien diplomat volunteer for a fight instead of a treaty. She decided in that moment that she trusted him. Fleet Command did not authorize a task force. It authorized grudgingly a single reconnaissance vessel with expanded discretionary orders, which was, Adaise suspected, the Admiral's way of hoping the problem would solve itself quietly, far from any cameras. She took it. She'd have taken less. Back aboard the Harmattan, Mika Vasquez had made herself useful in a way that surprised everyone except Tess, who had known her long enough not to be surprised by anything Mika decided to do. She and Tess had spent the transit days going through everything the two of them could access from Meridian Hollow's surviving archives: colony logs, supply manifests, personal correspondence Tess's mother had kept in the months before the attack. It was Tess who found it, hands shaking slightly around her translator collar as she read the message aloud. My mother wrote to my aunt 6 weeks before the attack. She said she'd found proof that Syndramoth Military Command had been infiltrated, that someone outside the collective was feeding Speaker Dvalka's staff intelligence, real and fabricated both, meant to push him toward war with the humans specifically. Tess's mandibles clicked, low and unsteady. She didn't ask for asylum because she was afraid of Syndramoth politics, Commander. She asked because she'd found evidence that could expose whoever was manipulating them. That's why they came for us, not because we were dissidents, because we knew. Mika's hand found Tess's, steady even though her own voice wasn't. They didn't burn the colony to punish my mother for hiding refugees, she said quietly to Adiz. They burned it to bury a witness. My mother just happened to be standing in the way. Adiz absorbed that in silence, feeling the shape of the tragedy shift under her. Heavier now, colder. It made sense of Dvalka's strange, haunted certainty on that last morning. A man who had believed his own righteousness so completely that he'd never questioned who had handed it to him. Toma's contribution came a day later, in the form of a jury-rigged signal relay built from a Syndramoth transponder housing and half the Harmattan's spare parts inventory, capable of quietly tracking encrypted Ashgrain pattern communications across a wide band without announcing its presence. It led them, 3 jumps and 11 days later, to a neutral trade station called Kello's Anchor, where, according to Toma's intercepted chatter, a courier was scheduled to make a data drop. The operation to intercept him was not a battle. It was, Adiz reflected afterward, something closer to a heist, and it was Mika, of all people, who suggested the plan that worked, posing as colony refugees seeking trade credit, blending into the crowded concourse in a way no uniformed fleet officer ever could, while Toma spoofed the station's security relay from a maintenance closet with wires held together by determination and static tape. They took the courier quietly, in a service corridor before he ever reached his contact. His name was Kess. He was younger than Adiz expected, human passing enough in build that under other circumstances she might have mistaken him for a colonist, until she saw the small, telltale neural implant scar behind his ear, the mark of an organization that didn't waste resources on agents who might one day think for themselves and decide not to. He didn't talk under threat. Toma's frustration built visibly as the hours passed with nothing but silence and a cold, steady stare. He talked when Adiz, against every voice in her own head telling her not to, ordered his restraints loosened and had food brought to him instead. Why? He asked, genuinely baffled, staring at the tray like it might be a trick. Because you're a person, not a data source, Adiz said, and because I'd like to think that's still worth something, even out here. Kess laughed, short and humorless. That's the thing Ashgrain never accounts for. They model everyone as a resource to be managed. They never build a model for someone doing something because it's right. He looked up at her, and something behind his exhaustion shifted. Not trust exactly, but the beginning of it. You want to know what Ashgrain actually is? Yes. It's what's left of an empire that used to run half this sector, before it collapsed under its own weight 300 years ago. The people who remember what that felt like, that kind of power, never stop trying to rebuild it. They can't do it with armies anymore. Too many alliances, too many treaties, too many species who'd unite against a single obvious threat. He leaned forward. So they don't build armies, they build reasons. They find the fault lines already running through every alliance and they widen them, quietly, patiently, until the people standing on either side do the collapsing for them. And Meridian Hollow? Adiz's voice was very quiet now. Kess hesitated, and for the first time since his capture, something like genuine unease crossed his face. Meridian Hollow wasn't supposed to matter. It was a side operation, Silence a dissident cell that had gotten too close to the truth, using a faction that was already primed to hate you. He shook his head slowly. But the real target was never the Syndrameth commander. It's the whole Frontier Alliance. And from what I've heard whispered in places I wasn't supposed to be listening, the real prize, the thing they actually want, sits in your home system. The comm panel behind them lit up sudden and violent, an alarm none of them had triggered. "Commander," came the sensor officer's voice, tight with fear. "Kess's biometrics just pinged an outbound signal. Something in his implant, we didn't catch it fast enough." Kess's face went white. "That's not possible. They wouldn't waste a tracker on a courier unless—" He stopped, and understanding dawned in his eyes with the particular horror of a man realizing he had never once, in his entire career, been anything but expendable. "Unless they wanted you to catch me." The Harmattan's hull groaned under the sudden, violent shudder of a mass exiting slipspace far too close for comfort. On the main view screen, a shape began to resolve out of the dark, vast, angular, wreathed in the cold blue running lights of a warship, built on a scale the Harmattan's entire crew had never seen outside a threat briefing. And behind it, converging from the opposite vector, sensors screaming a second contact, the remaining Syndrameth strike fleet, weapons already hot, Speaker Devalka's voice crackling furious and unmistakable across an open channel, still utterly convinced that the humans in front of him were the enemy he'd been sent to destroy. The Harmattan was caught between two guns, and Adaze had exactly one card left to play. "All hands brace for evasive," she called out, already dropping into her chair as the ship shuddered under the opening volley from Devalka's fleet. "Toma, tell me the drive can still jump us anywhere." "It can jump us into that dreadnought's shadow and nowhere else useful," Toma shot back from engineering, voice strained over the comm. "I'm not a miracle worker, Commander. I'm a mechanic with a grudge." The Ashgrain dreadnought had not fired yet. That more than anything told Adaze this wasn't a straightforward attack. It was a demonstration, patient and merciless, content to let the Kindramuth burn the humans while it watched. She thought of Kess's words. They never build armies. They build reasons. This was the end game of that philosophy, playing out in real time above her head. Two enemies, manufactured and manipulated, doing Ashgrain's killing for it. She made a decision that every tactical instinct told her was insane. Open a channel to Devalka. All frequencies, priority override. "Commander, he's not going to listen." "Open it." The Syndramoth commander's face resolved on the view screen, mandibles bared, weapons already cycling for a second volley. "You will not escape this time, human. Whatever tricks bought you the last engagement, they end here." "Speaker Devalka," Adaze said, and something in the sheer steadiness of her voice made him hesitate. Just slightly, weapons still charged, but not yet firing. "Look behind you. A diversion tactic beneath even your species. That dreadnought isn't Syndramoth, it isn't Vren Collective, it isn't mine. It's the thing that's been feeding your staff intelligence for the past year. The thing that convinced you Meridian Hollow was hiding a bioweapon program instead of a family that found out your command structure had been infiltrated." Adaze pulled up the recovered data, the coded messages, the star charts, the word Ashgrain repeated like a signature across a dozen falsified reports, and pushed it across the open channel. "I have the proof. I've had it since I boarded your crippled ship 11 days ago. You didn't burn a colony for the collective, Speaker. You burned it for them." The silence that followed lasted 4 full seconds, which on a bridge mid-battle felt like an hour. "You expect me to believe—" Devalka's voice cracked just barely, in a way it hadn't during the massacre, in a way that told Adaze he was no longer entirely certain of anything. "I expect you to look at your own intelligence logs. I expect you to ask why a resource violation report that started this whole war has no verified source. I expect you to remember that the family you were sent to silence had children in that shelter." Adaze leaned forward. "I can't give you back what you burned, Speaker. Nobody can. But you can decide right now whether you're going to keep being their weapon." On the Dreadnought's own sensor feed, data the Harmattan systems intercepted almost by accident, a leak Adaze would later suspect was deliberate, Kess's parting gift before his tracker went dark. Targeting locks were already sliding onto both the Syndramoth and human vessels alike. Ashgrain had never intended for either fleet to survive this. They were simply cleanup, either way the fight went. Devalka saw it too. Hadai's watched his expression change on the shared feed, disbelief curdling into something far colder and more final. "Helm," he said, voice raw, not to Hadai's but to his own bridge. "Bring us about. Target the Dreadnought's shield generators. All ships, converge fire." It was, Hadai's would say later, one of the strangest alliances ever formed in the middle of a live engagement. A Syndramoth strike fleet and a single battered human frigate turning their combined weapons on a common enemy they hadn't even known existed 20 minutes earlier. On the surface of Kessia 9 in the ruins of Meridian Hollow, Mika Vasquez felt the sky shake and looked up at streaks of light tearing across the dark. "They're fighting each other now," Tess said, watching the battle unfold from the observation ridge where they'd been coordinating survivor recovery. "The Syndramoth and the other ship, then we're not helpless down here." Mika was already moving, sprinting toward the collapsed maintenance shed that had, before the attack, housed the colony's old defense grid, a joint project, human engineers and Vren dissidents working side by side in the months before the massacre. One more piece of the alliance Ashgrain had tried to erase along with everyone who'd built it. "Thess, get everyone who can carry a toolkit. We're bringing the array back online." It should not have worked. The array had been half destroyed in the initial strike, its power conduits shredded, its targeting computer running on backup cells with maybe an hour of charge left. But Mika had grown up watching her mother solve impossible problems with insufficient resources, and Thess's people had built half the array's original architecture. And together, with a dozen exhausted survivors hauling cable and swearing in 3 languages, they coaxed it back to life, just as the Harmattan's combined fleet drove the wounded dreadnought into low orbit, trying to shake its pursuers. The ground array's first shot clipped the dreadnought's ventral shielding. Not a killing blow, nothing close, but enough to stagger its evasive pattern for the 2 critical seconds the Harmattan needed to land a full spread against its exposed flank. It cost them. A Syndramoth cruiser took a direct hit meant for the Harmattan and came apart in silent, terrible bloom of light. Aboard the Harmattan itself, a console exploded in engineering, and Toma Reyes went down hard, half buried under a collapsed support strut, blood dark against the deck plating as the ship rocked with a hit that nearly finished what the strain of the drive had started days ago. "Toma's down," came the shout over the comm, and Hadai's felt her chest seize even as she kept her hands steady on the console, because there was no time, not yet, not until the battle was decided one way or the other. The dreadnought's shields failed under the combined assault, venting atmosphere and debris in a long, ugly trail. But it did not die. It broke off, engines flaring, and vanished into slipspace, wounded and retreating, leaving behind wreckage and grief, and a silence on the comm channels that felt heavier than the battle itself had been. It was into that silence that Speaker Dvalka's voice returned, weaker now, his ship trailing atmosphere of its own. "Commander Okonkwo." He said her name carefully, like it cost him something. "I have transmitted everything my ship's intelligence systems hold on Ashgrain fleet movements, troop dispositions, communication ciphers, everything I should have questioned months ago and did not." A pause, static heavy. "It will not undo what I did to your colony. Nothing will. But it may be worth something at the end." "Dvalka, hold your position. We can get a medical team." "There is no position left to hold, Commander." His voice was almost gentle now, stripped of every trace of the fury she'd first met on Meridian Hollow's landing field. "Tell the girl, Thess's family. Tell them I am sorry it took their deaths to make me see clearly." The transmission cut, not from jamming this time, but from the slow, final failure of a ship that had given everything it had left in the fight. Hadai's watched the last of the Syndramoth vessel's signature fade from her scope, and felt something in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite relief, some third thing without a proper name. Below deck, medical teams were already fighting to stabilize Toma, his breathing shallow, one leg pinned wrong beneath the wreckage of his own console. The price, Adizi thought grimly, of an engineer who insisted on being in the middle of every crisis his ship survived. It was hours later, once Toma was stable and the ship's wounds were catalogued and the dead were counted with the particular, terrible arithmetic of a battle that had cost far more than it should have, that Yeth Corvain requested an urgent channel from the relay station. His voice, for the first time since Adaze had known him, entirely without its careful diplomatic calm. "Commander," he said, "I've spent the last 6 hours cross-referencing the fleet disposition Speaker Devalka transmitted, before he died against every Ashgrain movement pattern I've been able to track for the past 2 years." He paused, and even across the static fleck channel, Adaze could hear him steadying himself before he spoke again. "This wasn't a raiding party we drove off tonight. It was a scouting vessel, a single scout, sent to test your defenses and gather intelligence before the real force arrives." "How large a force?" "Large enough that I do not have a number that will comfort you." Yeth's voice dropped lower. "Commander, the coordinates in the data we recovered from that first Syndrameth ship, the ones pointing toward your home system, they were never meant to threaten a colony on the frontier." "Say it," Adaze said, though some cold, certain part of her already knew. "The Armada is going to Earth, and based on the fleet's current bearing and speed, they will arrive in 9 days. 9 days was not enough time to save a planet, and Adaze Okonkwo spent the first 30 hours of the journey home discovering exactly how not enough it was. Earth's governments, when Fleet Command finally briefed them, did not respond the way the crew of the Harmattan had hoped. There was no swift unification, no single decisive council speaking with one voice. There was instead a storm of competing sessions, the North Atlantic Compact demanding operational control of any defense fleet, the Pan-Asian Union questioning whether the Ashgrain threat was even real or an elaborate frontier miscalculation, 3 separate corporate defense contractors lobbying for procurement contracts while the clock ran down toward 0. Adaze watched the footage from a briefing room aboard the relay station and felt something in her that had survived a massacre and a running battle finally start to fray. "They're going to argue about jurisdiction until the enemy is in orbit," she said to Yeth, who had accompanied her back from Kessia 9, his diplomatic status the only thing keeping either of them in the room at all. "They are frightened," Yeth said simply. "Your species does not fight well when frightened and divided. I have observed this. But I have also observed that you fight extraordinarily well when frightened and united. And you have less time than you think to find out which one this becomes." It was Mika, 3 days into the journey, who forced the issue, not through fleet channels which had no patience for a 17-year-old colony survivor, but through the raw, unfiltered footage of Meridian Hollow's ruins that she and Thess had been quietly compiling since the attack. She released it not to the councils but to every public feed she could reach, the wheat fields burning, her mother's last transmission, the names of the dead read aloud by survivors in 3 languages. It was not tactics. It was grief, weaponized into clarity, and it worked where 100 briefings had failed. Within 6 hours of the footage going public, the competing councils found themselves facing a planet's population that no longer had patience for jurisdiction disputes. Adaze used the sudden, fragile unity like a blade. She stood before the Emergency Joint Council, human commanders in dress uniform beside a handful of alien liaisons who had never before been invited into an Earth defense briefing, and did not ask for permission this time. "We cannot win a conventional engagement," she said, watching the reflexive anger ripple through the room and letting it pass before continuing. "Their fleet outnumbers anything we can put in orbit in 9 days. If this becomes a straight fight, Earth loses, so it cannot become a straight fight." It was in the hours of frantic strategizing that followed that Kess recovered, restored to a fragile trust, working now beside the very people who'd captured him, delivered the piece of information that reframed everything that had come before it. He found Adaze alone in a maintenance corridor near the Harmattan's engineering bay, where Toma, leg still splinted, refused to convalesce anywhere he couldn't hear the ship's engines. Kess looked, for the first time since his capture, genuinely afraid. "I need to tell you something I should have said days ago," Kess said. I didn't understand it myself until I cross-referenced the compound samples in your colony's own agricultural records against Ashgrain's internal resource priorities. I have access to fragments of those from before I defected. It's why Meridian Hollow was ever a target at all. The crops, Adize said slowly. Elena Vasquez's drought-resistant wheat. It's not really about the wheat. Kess pulled up a molecular structure on his slate, patient despite his own unease, walking her through it the way a man explains something he wishes desperately wasn't true. The genetic stabilizing compound your colonists engineered to make those crops drought-resistant. It does something nobody on Meridian Hollow ever realized. It's chemically similar, almost identical in function, to a compound Ashgrain's homeworld needs to survive. Toma, listening from his cot with the stubborn attentiveness of a man who refused to be left out of anything happening on his own ship, frowned. Survive how? Ashgrain isn't a nation anymore. It's the remnant of an empire whose homeworld terraforming systems are failing, have been failing for decades. They rely on an extremely rare, extremely expensive compound to stabilize what's left of their biosphere. It's mined, refined, hoarded, rationed among their inner circle like water in a desert. It is the single greatest source of Ashgrain's remaining power, because whoever controls the supply controls who lives and who doesn't. Kess exhaled, and something in his voice cracked, the weight of finally saying it out loud. Your colonists synthesized a stable, reproducible version of that compound completely by accident, trying to grow wheat in dry soil. If that formula ever became public, if any other species learned how to replicate it cheaply, it wouldn't just weaken Ashgrain's economy. It would end their entire leverage over half a dozen client factions overnight. It would collapse whatever's left of their power in a single season. The room went very quiet. They didn't burn Meridian Hollow because a dissident family found evidence of infiltration, Adize said slowly, piecing it together even as she spoke it aloud. That's what triggered the timing. But the real reason the colony was ever a target, the reason it had to be erased completely, records and all, was because of what was growing in the fields. Elena Vasquez didn't die because of politics, Mika said from the doorway, and her voice was very steady, the steadiness of someone who has already cried everything she has and found something harder underneath it. She died because her wheat threatened to save a dying planet for free, and the people running out of time to steal that planet's future couldn't allow that. It was, in its way, worse than believing Ashgrain simply evil, and better too, in a manner none of them expected. Yeth, arriving partway through the explanation, was the one to say what Adize was already thinking. A desperate, dying civilization is not less dangerous than a cruel one, he said. But it is perhaps more capable of choosing a different path, if it is ever offered one. Mika's eyes sharpened. Then offer them one. It took the rest of that day and most of the night to shape the idea into something resembling a plan, and it was audacious enough that half the Joint Council initially refused to authorize it. Instead of hoarding the compound's formula as a bargaining chip or a weapon, Mika proposed broadcasting it, openly, freely, across every accessible frequency in Ashgrain-aligned space, alongside full technical documentation for replicating it. Not a threat, an offering. Proof that the thing Ashgrain was willing to commit genocide to protect could simply be given away, could stop being scarce enough to kill over. You want to hand your enemy the one thing keeping their whole coalition together, Admiral Wren said flatly, and just give it to them? I want to take away the reason they need to be an empire at all, Mika said. You can't outarm a desperate people forever, but you can make them not desperate. Every faction Ashgrain controls through resource dependency has been fighting for scraps of that compound for years. Once it's not scarce anymore, Ashgrain has nothing left to hold over them except fear. And fear doesn't survive contact with an alternative. Toma, still splinted, still stubborn, built the broadcast array himself over the following 2 days, refusing every offer of relief, running on painkillers and bitter determination. Yeth Corvain, against every instinct of self-preservation his diplomatic career had trained into him, volunteered to personally deliver the data into neutral, Ashgrain-adjacent worlds, where a broadcast alone might be dismissed as propaganda. A decision that meant leaving Earth's fragile safety, just as the Armada's arrival window closed toward zero. "If I am caught carrying this," he told Adaze quietly, before boarding the fast courier that would take him beyond fleet's protection, "there will be no rescue mission, and we both know it. I am doing this because I believe, after everything I have watched your people endure and choose to do regardless, that this is worth the risk. Do not waste it." Kes went with him, unasked, because, as he put it, with the first real smile Adaze had seen from him, "I know exactly what it sounds like when Ashgrain is lying to someone. Might as well be useful telling people how to spot it." On the 9th day, with Yeth and Kes's fate unknown and unreachable, with Earth's patchwork defense fleet arranged in the most coherent formation frightened, divided governments had ever managed to assemble on short notice, the Ashgrain Armada dropped out of slipspace at the edge of the solar system. It was not a scouting vessel this time. It was dozens of ships, arrayed with the cold precision of a fleet that had done this before, elsewhere, to civilizations that were never given the chance to answer back. At its center, a single command vessel broadcast an open channel to every human frequency it could find, and the face that appeared on Adaze's screen was not Speaker Devalka's fury, not Kes's fear, but something colder and older and infinitely more tired. A Concord matriarch, ancient even by the standards of a long-lived species, her voice carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had made peace with doing terrible things for what she believed were the right reasons. "I have seen your broadcast," the matriarch said before Adaze could speak a word. "Your offering, your compound freely given, no strings, no leverage." Something that might have been genuine, weary respect flickered across her ancient features. "It is a remarkable gesture. Under different circumstances, I might have wept to receive it." "Then accept it," Adaze said. "Nobody else has to die for something we're willing to simply give you." "A gift solves a resource problem," the matriarch said. "It does not solve a power problem. My people have built their entire remaining identity around control of that compound. If I accept your charity, I do not save my civilization. I dissolve what little authority holds it together, and it collapses into the same chaos that swallowed our empire 300 years ago." Her voice hardened, ancient grief curdling into something final. "Half measures will not save my world, Commander. Only Earth's resources, fully and permanently under our control, offer that certainty. I take no pleasure in what happens next, but I have buried too many of my own people to let sentiment stop me now." The channel cut. Across the tactical display, dozens of Ashgrain warships began to move in formation, weapons arrays cycling to full power, aimed not at a colony this time, not at a single frontier world, but at the blue and green planet turning slowly beneath them, the whole of humanity's home, with 9 days spent, every warning given, and nothing left now but the fight itself. The Battle of Earth began the way Adaze had known it would have to. Not with humanity's fleet standing in a straight line waiting to be outgunned, but scattered, clever, and furious, using every scrap of ground the solar system itself could offer. She had studied the debris fields of the outer asteroid belt for 2 straight days with Toma limping at her side, mapping every rock and ice fragment large enough to hide a frigate, every gravitational eddy that could mask a ship's signature for the crucial seconds a maneuver needed. It was the same trick that had crippled a Syndramoth cruiser months ago, scaled now to the size of an entire planetary defense. Command wants a defensive perimeter around the homeworld, Admiral Rennie argued one final time as the Armada's leading elements crossed the outer marker. "A perimeter is exactly what they're built to break," Adaze said. "We don't hold a line, we become the terrain." It worked for a while, the way desperate, brilliant plans work, buying time rather than promising victory. Human ships ran the asteroid corridors like Toma had once run engine repairs, patched together and stubborn, striking from cover and vanishing before Ashgrain's superior firepower could answer in kind. Decoy drones, built in every shipyard and garage that could spare the parts in 9 frantic days, flooded Ashgrain's sensors with false targets. It was not elegant. It was not the fight the matriarch's ancient, disciplined fleet had trained for. It was, Adaze thought grimly as she watched 2 Ashgrain cruisers collide, chasing a drone swarm through a debris cloud. Exactly the kind of fight nobody who studied humanity from a distance ever seemed to expect. But numbers were numbers, and for every trick that bought a minute, the Armada pressed closer to Earth's orbit, and losses mounted on both sides in a grinding, terrible arithmetic that no cleverness alone could outrun forever. It was Mika who changed the shape of the battle a second time. From a communications hub deep beneath the Nairobi command center, she and Thess had spent the fighting hours doing something no purely military strategy would have thought to try. Broadcasting directly into the Ashgrain fleet's own channels. Not propaganda, not threats, but the same raw footage that had once broken through Earth's own political paralysis. Survivor testimony from Meridian Hollow. Elena Vasquez's final transmission. Speaker Devalka's dying confession. Transmitted with Thess's permission, her voice steady even as it cost her something enormous to let a dead enemy's grief be heard by strangers. And beneath it all, over and over, the offer that Yeth and Kess were even now risking their lives to carry across a dozen worlds. The compound is free. Nobody has to die for it. Not you. Not us. It should not have worked against a fleet mid-battle, disciplined and ancient and utterly unused to doubt. But cracks, Addies would come to understand later, do not need a large force to widen them. Only pressure applied in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, and the truth, spoken plainly by people with nothing left to gain from lying. The first defection came 40 minutes into the battle. A single Ashgrain support cruiser breaking formation, turning its weapons not on the humans but on the flank of its own fleet. Its crew declaring over an open channel that they would not spend their lives protecting a scarcity that had just been proven a lie. The matriarch's response was immediate, and it was the moment the entire battle turned from desperate stalemate into something far more dangerous. If they will not fight, her voice crackled across every channel, cold and final, then I will end this the only way that still guarantees my people's survival. The weapon that began charging at the heart of her command vessel was not a conventional armament. Toma recognized the energy signature before Fleet's own analyst did, his voice going hollow over the comm from the makeshift engineering station he'd refused to abandon, despite his splinted leg. "That's a planet cracker," he said. "Commander, that's not a ship killer, that's a world killer. If she fires that at Earth, then we stop her from firing it," Adaizi said, already turning the Harmattan toward the command vessel's position, every instinct screaming that this was the same insane gamble she'd made against Valka, offered now to a woman with far less reason to accept it. What happened in the next 20 minutes would be told, retold, and eventually taught in academies across a dozen worlds, as the moment humanity's reputation among the stars truly changed. Not because of the weapon that nearly fired, but because of what stopped it. Toma assembled a countermeasure in real time that should not have been possible. A scavenged, improvised interference field built not by human engineers alone, but by a scrambled, desperate coalition patched together in the chaos of battle. Vren defectors from Devalka's old command structure, now flying alongside Fleet under a fragile new alliance forged from his final confession. Cylindre technicians Yeth had quietly arranged weeks earlier, in case diplomacy ever needed an engineering backstop, and human crews running calculations faster than any single species doctrine had ever demanded of them. It was ugly. It was improvised out of spare parts and shared desperation. It held for exactly as long as they needed it to. Adais brought the Harmattan alongside the Matriarch's command vessel through a gap in its shield, created by the interference field, close enough that weapons no longer mattered as much as words did, and opened a channel one final time. "You said a gift doesn't solve a power problem," Adais said, watching the planet cracker's charge indicator climb toward completion on her own tactical display, every second a held breath. "You're right. It doesn't. But it's not the only thing we're offering." "There is nothing else to offer, Commander. My people are dying. I have exhausted patience for half measures." "Then don't take a half measure. Take sanctuary." Adese kept her voice steady, though her hands, out of view of the camera, were not. "Full technology transfer. A seat at every alliance table. Your empire burned bridges to reach 300 years ago. Not because you've earned it through conquest, but because enough of your own people today chose to stop fighting for a lie the moment they heard the truth. That's not weakness, matriarch. That's the only thing that's ever actually held an alliance together for longer than a single desperate generation. The matriarch did not answer immediately. On the Harmattan's sensors, more defections rippled through the Ashgrain formation. 3 ships, then 7, then a dozen, crews breaking from a command structure that had asked them to die protecting a scarcity that no longer existed, turning instead toward the strange, stubborn coalition of species offering something Ashgrain's entire philosophy had never once tried. An ending that didn't require anyone else's ruin. You would truly welcome us, the matriarch said at last very quietly. After what we did to that colony. After what I nearly did to this planet. I watched a Syndramoth commander choose at the very end of his life to turn his weapons against the thing that used him instead of the people he'd wronged, Adaisy said. I don't think mercy is a reward for people who never made mistakes, matriarch. I think it's the only thing that ever actually stops the mistakes from repeating. The planet cracker's charge indicator held at 90% for 3 seconds that felt like a lifetime. Then it began, slowly, to power down. The weapon never fired. Toma's improvised field collapsed a heartbeat after the matriarch gave the stand-down order, and for the first time in 9 desperate days, the skies above Earth went quiet. Not silent with the aftermath of destruction, but with the strange, unfamiliar stillness of a war that had ended without a final, total victory for either side. Because neither side had needed one after all, the weeks that followed were not simple. There were tribunals and grief and the long, unglamorous work of turning a ceasefire into something that might actually last. Yeth Corvain and Kess returned from their mission changed, thinner, quieter, carrying scars from 3 worlds where their broadcast had not been welcomed gently, but alive and instrumental in the slow work of folding Ashgrain's fractured remnant into an alliance it had spent 3 centuries trying to destroy instead. A year later, Meridian Hollow bloomed again. It was smaller than before, and different. A joint colony now, human engineers working alongside Vren architects and Silendri botanists, and, in a detail that made Micah's throat tighten every time she walked past it, a small research annex staffed by Ashgrain scientists who had once studied the compound as a weapon, and now studied it as a gift, refining it further, sharing every discovery freely with worlds that had once been enemies. At the center of the rebuilt colony stood a monument Mika herself had designed. A wall of names, human and Vren both, colonists and Speaker Devalka's crew included among the dead, because Mika had insisted, over the initial objections of a council still uneasy with forgiveness, that a monument which only mourned one side's losses wasn't peace. It was just a smaller kind of war. Adaisy stood before it on the day of its unveiling, no longer captain of a limping frigate, but something closer to what Yeth had once become without meaning to. A person other species now looked to, not because she commanded the largest fleet, but because she had proven more than once that she would rather offer a hand than a threat. Even in the exact moment, it would have been easiest not to. Beside her, Toma leaned on a cane he pretended to resent and secretly treasured as a battle trophy, already deep in conversation with a young Vren engineer about improvements to the colony's power grid. Thess stood near the monument's edge, one claw resting lightly against her mother's name, Mika's hand steady in her other one, the two of them exactly where they'd been the morning it all began, except that the sky above them now was full of ships that had stopped being enemies, and the wheat in the fields beyond was growing free for anyone who needed it. Mika looked out over the gold stalks swaying in a wind that no longer carried smoke, and thought that her mother would have liked this ending best of all. Not because humanity had won, in the way old stories always promised victory, but because in the end, the thing that saved 2 worlds and quietly rebuilt a third had never been a weapon at all. It had been a stubborn, unreasonable refusal to stop offering a hand to anyone still willing to take it, even the ones who had once tried to burn it off. And in the fields of Meridian Hollow, beneath a sky finally free of smoke, that refusal kept growing, season after season, long after everyone who remembered the fire had learned at last how to call it home again.